People who are living with a disability are some of the most vulnerable in our community. So things like the fuel hikes and the law changes to e-bikes can and do affect them in more life-altering ways than you might expect or that you might experience in your own life. So to discuss what's being felt in the local disability community now, you're joined by River Knight, co-founder of Developing Australian Communities. River, thanks so much for joining us. So let's start with living with a disability during this time of such turbulence with the fuel prices, with the law changes. Like, what are people experiencing?
Well, we've recently launched a national survey, and what we're hearing is that a lot of people are really, really concerned and stuck at home now. They're really concerned with service providers refusing to pick up shifts and transport more than a certain amount of kilometres because they can't afford it. They can't charge fuel to NDIS. You know, if NDIS doesn't pay for that sort of stuff. So providers have to absorb it, which means that providers are now tightening the reins and people are stuck at home.
And I gather in that survey, like, you're hearing things from, like, basically expressions of fear. Like, people are afraid of what's going to happen to them and what this means for the level of support that they're getting through the NDIS.
It is, because getting out to the community is something that every human being likes to do. And when you can't go shopping and you can't go to your appointments and you don't live next to your hospital, it means that you are, I guess, isolated in that community. Maxi taxis for people with mobility issues are way too expensive to be using every day because no one can afford it on a disability support pension. They certainly can't afford the gold price of fuel right now. And e-bikes, of course, and those little sort of, valuable bits of equipment are actually probably the lifeline for a lot of people with disability who can't afford a car, probably can't ever get a car license, but at least it gives them that mobility and access, similar to the rest of Australia.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the e-bikes in a moment, but just in terms of the impact on support workers, like, so an NDIS support worker who's looking after a few different clients who's then having to absorb the increased cost of fuel, like, what's the capacity there? We're not talking about big corporations absorbing a cost. We're talking about individual people who aren't necessarily paid that well in the first place. Have I got that right?
Yeah, so NDIS pays the dollar something per kilometre to support work or service providers when a support worker takes a person with a disability out in their vehicle. So you can imagine in Brisbane, if I do 40 kilometres, there's $45 to $50 of my funding being used up, plus the cost of the support worker's hourly rate at $60 an hour plus during the week and more on the weekend. So just to go shopping like every other person now becomes a $300 to $400 to $500 experience for NDIS to foot the bill. Service providers try to absorb that as much as they can, but they're not funded and helped to do that by NDIS. And of course, there's no real strategy involved in terms of going, hey, well, how can we do this better? It's just something that NDIS hasn't really thought about. And of course, we can't expect support workers who are mums and dads working to simply cop the cost, which means that people living with disability now have to choose between going to health appointments and, of course, the e-version of medical appointments that we saw during COVID. They just don't cut it and also then create that additional mental health stress, which increases people's support needs, and it's a bit of a vicious cycle.
Now, on the question of e-bikes or e-devices, one of the sort of headline rule changes that is being talked about is requiring that you have to have at the very least a learner's permit to be able to use an e-bike. What would the impact of that be on people who have a disability?
Well, for many people living with disability, we don't have licenses and driver's licenses. We rely on the 18 plus card because a lot of people with a physical disability or even just a minor impairment or a cognitive impairment, they simply cannot meet the standards needed for a driver's license for a heavy vehicle like a car. So to sort of bring that in for a scooter, or a low-speed e-bike is a little bit of an overreach and a little bit silly. So the survey that we've just conducted, the feedback that we got is that the community is saying, look, we should be thinking about, for example, a safety course, something sensible, because when you're looking at the low-powered e-bikes, the low-powered scooters, community change doesn't happen through laws. It happens through education. So, what we're asking for and pushing is a safety course, rather than going for a full heavy vehicle license, which is going to exclude the majority of people with a disability that can't get a license.
Now, we've had a text from a listener on this going, well, if a person with a disability doesn't qualify for a learner's permit, should they be on any form of motorised transport at all? I mean, doesn't that actually say this is not really safe for you? If you can't manage a learner's permit, then you shouldn't be able to manage any kind of motorised transport. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a very typical one we hear in the disability sector, that if you have any type of slight impairment, which affects the majority of Australians, you can't do anything. And this kind of all-or-nothing approach is really offensive to most people living with disability. When you're talking about managing a vehicle that weighs several tons on a road, that's a big task. And I tell you what, I can do a lot of damage with an SUV. When we're talking about small, low-powered, low-speed e-bikes and scooters, you do not need to have the same level of functioning capacity as someone operating a heavy vehicle. It's chalk and cheese, and it's not comparable. You can have a visual impairment and still be able to manage very safely these sorts of e-bikes. And we're not talking about the ones that we see the young people and adults hooning down the road going 50 kilometres an hour at. We're talking about people going 5 to 10 k's an hour, just like we do in wheelchairs right now, where we have electric wheelchairs that are chin-controlled and hand-controlled, that are registered vehicles, and people use them all the time. So we are absolutely supporting safety and speed limits, but to compare operating a massive vehicle that's several tons to a scooter is utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, it's apples and oranges. But then you're talking about, or you were mentioning this idea of giving a safety training course in place of a licensing requirement or a license requirement. I mean, I suppose, is that maybe pointing towards an alternate license? Like you go through the safety course, you get your certification for that, which I suppose is a license in a way, but it's something more specific to e-bikes and scooters.
Well, it makes sense because law and legislation is not what impacts behaviour change, and we know that. So government changes laws, and that's what they're doing. But we're essentially trying to safeguard the community. And the way we've seen that done with every other thing to do with transport is about community education. That's why we're suggesting a safety course, because we've seen that with drink driving. The laws don't change drink driving. The massive education campaign did that. We saw that when we brought in the idea of seatbelts, which people thought was stupid at the time. It's education that got that behaviour change. And of course, we see it with the safe speed limits that we see on cars now. It's education that makes that change, not laws, because the police do not have the capacity to govern and police millions of Australians around this country. So it's education campaigns that make the difference. And of course, we're not talking about the 40 to 50 to 80 kilometre an hour e-bikes that the kids hoon down past my house on. We're talking about slow, low-powered vehicles being lumped in with the big, scary, fast ones. So we're saying a safety course should be enough. When I got my boat license, I spent a few hours with someone. I spent 2 minutes in front of a boat, actually holding onto the steering wheel, and I managed to get a license. We don't need to do more than that for a scooter.
River Knight, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And River Knight is the co-founder of Developing Australian Communities, and just sharing the lived experience of people with disabilities with regards to the fuel crisis and the issue of e-devices.